Welcome back to Business Week here on Arise News. I'm joined now by Adesola, Associate Director, Control Risk, to review some of our top stories in more detail. Good morning, Damilare. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So I'd like to start with the OPEC Plus story, which is that OPEC is going to be adding more production from September. But it's interesting because globally, we've just seen jobs reports in the US saying demand is down. But then you have Saudi, which needs above $80 to balance its budget. So why would OPEC be adding back production at such a time? Why wouldn't it just look to shore up prices as they are?
So, one of the ways to shore prices would be to cut back some of those productions. Originally, those cuts were actually introduced not as the quotas. That one is separate. It was actually part of the 2023 voluntary cut. So they were always supposed to just be something temporary to stop gap in the market at the time when a lot of geopolitical tensions was causing a lot of downward pressure on the price of oil globally. But since that it's stabilized in some ways in the fact that there have been other contributing factors that are supporting the price of oil, whether it's looking at the Iran war and some of those dynamics there, but then ultimately understanding that OPEC is after its own interest, despite the fact that yes, a good price is nice to have, but at the same time, ultimately the goal is to have the interest of its own producers over time, and it was always supposed to be voluntary.
It's interesting. I'm wondering how long they can keep that up before the fiscal realities for countries like Saudi start to bite, because the challenge is when you release oil back into the market, you also don't want to overshoot, because you want to take into account other sentiment around the world around demand. Interesting. But the AFDB is saying that Africa needs between 90 billion and 100 billion annually to meet its development goal. But the AFDB is essentially saying that West Africa, I think that was the region of focus, actually has enough money. The problem is that capital is not finding the right investment. So where is that intermediation broken? What is going on in that chain connecting capital to investment?
I think the AFDB report is very interesting. It actually highlights 4 places where that capital is sort of locked locally. Looking at the informal economy, we always talk about how Africa, I think the numbers they put there was about over 90% of jobs are contributed by the informal economy, and I think that's very significant. The second thing is about tax and tax revenues, expanding, broadening the base of tax, clamping down on tax evasion. The third being sovereign wealth funds and savings of different countries like Nigeria. We're seeing a lot more of that. And the fourth being institutional investors, insurance reserves, and pension funds. And all of these conversations are things that we've been saying is nothing new particularly, but I think what's interesting is the conclusion that it's making, that we don't need to, essentially that financial sovereignty, that fiscal sovereignty, that West African countries can actually achieve it if they mobilize some of that local capital that is sort of stuck in all of these different areas.
So it's interesting, you've identified all these 4 things, and we talk about Nigeria's pension funds assets. We're now almost at 31 trillion. So we know where the intermediation chain is broken. Who's responsible for fixing it?
That's a very key question. Ultimately, the onus falls on the government, but I think a lot more increasingly having folks like the AFDB produce material like that and broker those conversations between the private sector, because institutional investors, it's private money, right? It's private, it's funds from you and I, our savings, or retirement funds, and so there's still a lot of reluctance, and the risk appetite is still very low when it comes to sort of the opportunities. But even those opportunities are very limited, and whether it's infrastructure, investing in private credit, and so I think it's a collaboration between the organizations, multilaterals like AFDB, with the government and the private sector to see sort of ways that they can shore up that investment and essentially de-risk that aspect of things, so that long-term credit can be made available for infrastructure and capital development in these regions.
Okay. So now this NNPC story, the National Economic Executive Council has approved the refinancing of Project Gazelle, which is this loan that is backed by future oil revenues, refinanced into a new 4.5 billion arrangement, right? Now, we know that oil prices could potentially be under pressure. We're just talking about the fact that OPEC is adding new barrels to the market. Now, with oil prices potentially under pressure and the fact that these loans are backed by future oil revenues, how strong do you think this underlying collateral is, which is essentially oil? You know, what do you make of this refinancing?
I think the collateral is strong. I think especially because the government is looking at our increased production that we've had over the last, June figures of 1.56 is the highest since April 2020. So I think they are looking at how we've managed to show up local production, and that doesn't even take account of the condensate. But I think a key concern for me remains, first of all, that liquidity continues to be the priority for the government as opposed to sort of the long-term fiscal stability, and that liquidity continues to be sourced from external sources like borrowing, and sort of putting that future fiscal stability, sacrificing that for so short-term liquidity. And they talk about how it's good and they're reducing the burden for the debt, but when you look at the fact that we have multiple arrangements or multiple crude back arrangements, it then begs the question of what is Nigeria doing to achieve that long-term fiscal stability when it comes to how we're liquidity, FX, and all this. It was understandable when Project Gazelle was launched in 2023. We had just introduced the reforms and liquidity injection was needed, but now I don't think the argument for refinancing can really just be justified from that liquidity. I'll be curious to see how
that's an interesting point, because we keep refinancing this oil-backed debt with larger facilities. So at what point in your mind does this move from becoming just liquidity management to structural dependency on one sector?
Exactly. That's really the question. And I think one of the critiques of the government, not just this government, of policymakers over time in Nigeria, has been that long-term perspective, and it remains lacking. Essentially, that liquidity of today, we need to show up our foreign revenues, foreign reserves rather. Today, everything's about today and what we're going to do today, as opposed to, okay, how can we achieve that in the long term? And it continues to be under pressure. I know the oil sector is great. It's booming. It's a really strong source of revenue for the government at the moment, but there's still so many. We talked about taxes and informal sectors and other sources of revenue that the government could be looking to sort of complement that. And so I think it's really just about how the policymakers are really approaching that long-term stability conversation when it comes to an address position.
Interesting. Oil is obviously not a infinite resource, but interesting times there. Nigeria's borrowing outlook. We're simultaneously a victim and a perpetrator of cyber crimes, according to this report, the African Cyber Threat Assessment Report. What do you think that sort of dual status actually costs us in terms of FDI and investment, and in terms of correspondent banking relationships, for instance?
So on one hand, the report from Interpol's great report there, it actually quantifies that to 434 million as the loss in the last year. That's a 1 year figure. But like you mentioned, it's about the optics as well. It's about how that looks to the outsiders, the investors, or whatever it is, FDI, our borrowing stance, and those conversations. And I think it boils down to what our institutions are doing about cybercrime, and it still remains highly lacking. Cybercrime is increasingly becoming very sophisticated. One thing interesting that I found in that document was saying that AI now accounts for 55% of cybercrime, where it's making it fast and efficient, where before there was a sort of technical barrier to entry essentially for fraud, but now it's made it a lot easier, because you can just go and on your laptop you can do a lot of different social engineering and fraud and identity theft, and a lot of things have just essentially made it a lot easier to propagate these things. And we do have the sort of regulations and the structures, but this isn't just a conversation for government alone. I know that the NBS was a target of hacking incident 2024 into 2025, but also private sector is also reeling from that, and it's just really the exchange of that data, the exchange of that the different systems and procedures, whether it's with the banking or telecoms or with fintech guys and the government and session. That collaboration is very essential, and will continue to weigh negatively on how Nigeria is perceived as an investment destination, but even also as a partner and just as a country in the global stage.
Okay, very well said. So let's move to the last story. So 1.4 trillion naira in 6 months on beer, malt and spirits. Now, in our economy, we've seen consumer credit collapse by 40%. Inflation is above 16%, above 15%. What does that tell us about household spending priorities? Right? when you have that kind of figure, especially with the collapse of consumer credit, and you know what the macroeconomic indicators are, and especially what does it mean for these consumer-facing businesses?
I think what's even interesting is the fact that this number is just from Nigerian breweries. It's not even like the total national spend on that. So I will be curious to see what that number is. I think, first of all, I see it as a resilience factor where the resilience of the consumer is still there. But we've always said that FMCG, specifically food, even food that is considered to be indulgent, consumption, is still very resilient when it comes to consumer categories, and it continues to remain, a potential for whether it's private sector investment and so on. So we're looking at what that could mean for manufacturing and how that, that could be a sort of argument for investment into manufacturing that is targeted at food and some of these different categories. So I believe that it's an interesting fact that Nigerians still like to party and jaye, but at the same time, it's also indicative of the resilience of the consumption, private consumption in Nigeria.
Yeah, I mean, the brewing sector is also one of the few consumer industries actually growing in revenue right now in Nigeria. Thank you so much, Damilare, for sharing your expertise and insights as always.